what is it that truly distinguishes an expert?
Mm-hmm.
How do people get that deep understanding in their field?
Yeah, it's fascinating. We've all met people who just seem to get it right, almost intuitively.
Exactly. Okay, let's try and unpack that, because today on the deep dive, we're really going deep into the minds of, well, masters.
Mm-hmm.
We've pulled together insights from a whole collection of interviews, people who are genuinely at the top of their game. Think Robert Greene talking with others who've achieved that kind of mastery.
And the range is just incredible when you look at it. I mean, we're talking computer programming with Paul Graham.
Right.
And the unique world of Temple Grandin,
Right.
autism advocacy, animal science,
Linguistics with Daniel Everett.
robotics, engineering with Yoko Takashima, V.S. Ramachandran on the brain.
Such different fields.
Totally. And Santiago Calatrava's architecture, Freddie Roach in boxing, Cesar Rico Rodriguez in military aviation. It's quite a list.
It really is a diverse group.
Mm.
And our mission here, well, it's to kind of distill the wisdom, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Find the common threads, the unique paths these people took to get so good, to see the world differently.
Yeah, think of it as maybe a shortcut, a way to grasp some of these core ideas about learning and skill, but straight from the source, from people who've actually lived it.
So where does it start? That initial spark, maybe. What gets someone going down that path?
Well, looking at their early days, you do see some interesting patterns emerge.
Absolutely. Like Paul Graham, he talked about books being like letters from people who lived in places that were not Pittsburgh.
That's a great way to put it.
Isn't it? That curiosity about something else, plus computers starting to appear.
Mm-hmm.
He mentions the Macintosh around, 77, 78, graduated 82. Those early interests, they clearly mattered.
They really did. And then you have someone like Daniel Everett. He felt people didn't expect much from him intellectually growing up. So his response was this intense personal mission, really, to learn rigorously, all self-driven. It shows how limitations can actually fuel you.
Or Temple Grandin. Her art was encouraged early on, and it's amazing how she used that visual thinking, like getting aerial views of feed mills to figure out how they worked, almost like early design work.
Yeah, and just reading everything she could find on animal behavior, that deep dive into the literature early on, it was foundational.
So it seems like that initial interest, that pull, it's vital,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not enough on its own, is it?
No, definitely not. That passion needs work. Deep, sustained effort.
Which leads us right into this idea of deep immersion.
Mm-hmm.
Paul Graham talked about really getting Lisp, the programming language.
Uh-huh.
He forced himself to put whole programs in a book, like actually write them out.
Wow, that sounds intense.
Right. But he said that forced him to understand it at this incredibly deep level. And interestingly, he felt understanding Lisp that was key to understanding modern programming generally.
So it wasn't just about Lisp itself, it was about the underlying principles.
Exactly. Unlocking something fundamental.
And Daniel Everett with the Piraham people, that's another powerful example of immersion, but culturally.
Totally. His whole point was you can't write a grammar for a language without living it, experiencing the culture.
Right. He was out there hunting with them, using an axe, doing the daily stuff. That lived experience was inseparable from his linguistic insights. He couldn't have gotten it from books alone.
No way. And Temple Grandin, she talks about participatory knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Explain that a bit.
It's learning through doing, through direct experience. She could see instantly why cattle balked at a gate, because it was jiggling slightly.
Something you wouldn't notice unless you were really there, really observing closely.
Exactly. It's that embodied understanding, something you can't just get from theory. It suggests that in any field, really getting your hands dirty gives you insights you just wouldn't get otherwise.
That makes sense. And you see it even in unexpected places, like Cesarico Rodriguez. He mentioned football.
Yeah. How did that connect?
He realized that understanding all 11 positions on the field, the whole system, helped him grasp the 3 dimensions of flying. That spatial awareness translated.
Wow. So deep understanding in one area can obviously provide a foundation for another, seemingly unrelated one.
Exactly. It's about understanding the whole picture.
Now, these people weren't just figuring it all out alone in a room, were they? Learning from others, mentorship, that seems important too.
Definitely. Paul Graham had an interesting take on mentors. He said it's about finding someone more sophisticated, not necessarily older.
Right. He mentioned learning from Robert Greene, actually.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, though he was quite humble about it, saying he wouldn't presume Robert learned anything back.
Typical. But it shows mentorship can be more of a mutual influence sometimes.
Good point. And V.S. Ramachandran, the neuroscientist, he really stressed finding professors with that creative spark and passion, especially for grad students.
Yeah, he talked about finding this Renaissance man with humor and brilliance and just doing experiments with him, finding people who ignite your own curiosity.
That spark seems key. And then there's the more traditional route, like Freddie Roach with Eddie Futch.
The boxing trainer.
Yeah. Roach learned by being incredibly dependable, loyal, just being there. And eventually, Futch trusted him with his whole stable of fighters.
So that sustained commitment, that apprenticeship model, it really worked there. It shows mentorship isn't just about asking questions. It's about connection, trust, absorbing experience.
Right. Finding people who push your thinking and share that deep lived experience.
Okay, so what about the actual process? How do skills get built?
Well, this idea of automaticity is interesting. When something becomes automatic, like driving or, operating levers, your mind is freed up. Temple Grandin mentioned reading about how the motor cortex takes over learned tasks from the frontal cortex. Your brain literally rewires itself.
That makes sense. It frees up bandwidth for higher level strategy or thinking.
Exactly. And Grandin also pointed out that improvement is usually gradual. It's not one big breakthrough moment.
Right. Steady progress over time.
Yeah, she talked about her own talks getting better over decades just through practice and feedback and learning what not to talk about, like rambling or controversial stuff, based on reactions.
So it's that constant self-correction loop alongside building the core skill.
Totally. And Daniel Everett's reading habits, summarizing every page before moving on.
That sounds incredibly disciplined.
It does. Rereading, if he felt his understanding was vague, is that active engagement, not just passively absorbing information. That seems vital for real mastery.
That active processing. And Yoko Takashima brought up an interesting point about focus, especially in science.
Oh, yeah.
She noted how that intense focus you often have when you're younger can really boost productivity, creativity, but then life gets more complicated. Multitasking takes over.
So the conditions for learning can change throughout your life. That's a good point.
It really is.
What's also striking is how many of these masters weren't afraid to push back, to challenge the status quo.
Yeah, definitely a common thread. Paul Graham, for instance, talked about having contrarian views early on, like realizing maybe venture capital wasn't always the best idea for very early startups.
And that the best ideas often seem kind of weird at first.
Exactly. That willingness to question the accepted way of doing things.
Daniel Everett is maybe the prime example. Sticking to his guns about the Pirahan language, even though it flew in the face of big names like Chomsky.
Because his immersion gave him that deep conviction, right? He saw things that the existing theories just couldn't explain.
Right, like the idea that their language doesn't really use concepts like all or some the way we do. That came directly from living the culture.
That conviction born from experience. V.S. Ramachandran talked about developing a nose for anomalies.
I like that phrase.
Me too.
Yeah.
The idea that the real gold in research is often in the weird stuff, the things that don't quite fit.
And his low-tech approach gave him the freedom to chase those anomalies, maybe. Not being tied down by complex equipment or rigid protocols.
Plausibly, yeah. More flexibility. And you mentioned Robert Greene earlier, from Paul Graham's perspective. Greene's ability to reframe things like money and wealth.
Yeah, looking at familiar things in a totally new way. That power of reframing seems critical for insight.
Absolutely, shifting the perspective.
Interestingly, sometimes the limits are what spark creativity.
Yeah.
Santiago Calatrava, the architect.
Mm-hmm.
He sees constraints not as problems, but as a positive part of designing, like a complex math equation you have to solve elegantly.
So the constraints actually help the process.
That's his view. He used this image of having to bend the arrow to get it through several holes. You have to be clever within the limits.
It's a fantastic metaphor.
Isn't it? And he also believes that the core idea, the initial concept, has to flow through everything, every little detail.
Right down to the door handles, presumably.
Exactly. And that the architect needs to be there right till the end of construction to protect that vision.
That level of commitment. Wow.
He also had this interesting idea about educare versus inducare.
Okay, break that down.
Educare he saw as like taking skills out of someone. But inducare is putting them in. His point was that the ideas are already inside us. Education's about drawing them out, not just pouring knowledge in.
That's a very different take on education, more about facilitating discovery from within.
Exactly.
So we've talked about rigorous practice, challenging norms, but what about intuition, that gut feeling?
Crucial, right. V.S. Ramachandran had this beautiful description of intuition in science. He called it a curious oxymoron.
How so?
He said it requires intense obsession and passion, but also playfulness. And he stressed the importance of incubation, just letting ideas sit and develop in the background.
So hard focus combined with letting go, that is paradoxical.
It is. And Temple Grandin's quick grasp of layouts or how an animal might be feeling, that seems purely intuitive.
Like a visceral feel for it.
Yeah, built on years of observation, no doubt. But it manifests as this instant knowing. It goes beyond just rational analysis.
And that kind of intuition often seems linked to perspective taking, doesn't it?
Good point. Like Grandin understanding cattle because she could see the world from their perspective. Wide-angle vision, prey animals.
That empathy informs the intuition.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Daniel Everett saying, you have to understand the culture deeply to communicate effectively, like when he was translating the Bible. It's all about seeing from the other side.
Empathy as a core skill for mastery, in a way.
In many fields, definitely.
Yeah.
But of course, it's not always smooth sailing. Failure seems like part of the deal.
Oh, absolutely. You have to learn from the mistakes. Paul Graham talked about the very first Y Combinator batch.
Yeah.
They kind of saw it as a throwaway in hindsight. But the lessons they learned from that batch about being investors, about what made their own earlier company, ViaWeb, significant, those lessons were invaluable.
So the failure was actually incredibly productive.
In the long run, yes. And Cesar Rica Rodriguez, he apparently struggled initially in flight school.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
You wouldn't expect that from a top pilot.
Right. But he used self-analysis, sheer determination to turn it around. It shows that resilience, that willingness to face your weaknesses and push through is critical.
Confronting the struggle. Yeah.
And finally, mastery often isn't solitary. Teamwork, leadership, that comes into play too.
Like Rodriguez, again, using his football background.
Exactly. Understanding team concepts, the importance of being the best possible wingman, not just focusing on your own glory.
Right. And realizing that a successful air campaign, it's everyone's success.
Yeah.
It's bigger than just the fighter pilot.
That collective aspect.
So wrapping this up, there's some really strong themes here, aren't there?
Definitely. That deep immersion, learning through direct experience, that comes up again and again.
Yeah, and understanding different perspectives, being willing to question the basics.
The mix of intuition and really hard, deliberate practice.
And just continuous learning. It never really stops.
No, like Temple Grandin said, mastery isn't some fixed point you arrive at. It's a journey. Her talks are still improving.
That's a great point. It's always evolving.
So maybe a final thought for you listening. Which of these ideas really hit home for you?
Yeah, which ones connect with your own way of learning or your own field? How could you maybe apply some of this, the deep dives, the practice, questioning assumptions to get better at what you do?
It's worth thinking about and definitely worth exploring the work of these individuals further. There's so much more there.